The Nigerian Civil War, also called the Biafra War, lasted from July 6, 1967, to January 13, 1970. It was a conflict that started when the southeastern provinces of Nigeria, mostly inhabited by the Igbo people, tried to break away and form their own country called Biafra. The war lasted 2.5 years and saw international involvement. France, South Africa, and Portugal sent weapons to support the Biafran rebels, while the federal government got help from the USSR and Great Britain. Most African countries also backed the federal government. Between 500,000 and 2 million people are estimated to have died in the war, mostly from starvation. When the world saw the images of the suffering through the media, it caused a strong reaction, highlighting the urgent need for humanitarian aid. Nigeria gained independence on October 1, 1960. Abubakar Tafawa Balewa became the first federal prime minister, a position he had held since 1957, while Nnamdi Azikiwe took on the largely ceremonial role of president of the Senate. On October 1, 1963, Nigeria officially became a republic, with Azikiwe as president, but Tafawa Balewa, as prime minister, still held more political power. In Nigeria and its surrounding area, long-standing issues like ethnic rivalry, educational inequality, and economic imbalance became more noticeable during a disputed census in 1962–63. Nigeria's largest ethnic groups were the Igbo, making up about 60–70% of the population in the southeast, the Hausa Fulani of the Sokoto Caliphate, who made up around 67% of the northern population, and the Yoruba, who represented about 75% of the population in the southwest. To try to reduce ethnic conflict, Nigeria created the Midwest region in 1963 by splitting the western region. Even with this division, the country remained divided into 3 main regions, each dominated by a different ethnic group: the Yoruba in the west, the Igbo in the east, and the Hausa Fulani in the north. This created constant conflict as regional leaders defended their power. The south felt controlled by the north, while the north feared the southern elites wanted to take over. In the west, the government broke down in 1962, and a boycott of the 1964 federal election almost led Nigeria to collapse. On January 15, 1966, Major Chukwuma Kaduna Nzeogwu, Major Emmanuel Ifejuna, and other junior army officers, mostly majors and captains, tried to stage a coup. They killed 2 key northern leaders, Prime Minister Sir Abubakar Tafawa Balewa and the Premier of the northern region, Sir Ahmadu Bello. Bello's wife and other northern officers were also killed. The president, Sir Nnamdi Azikiwe, who was Igbo, was on vacation in the West Indies and didn't return until days later. Many people suspected that Igbo leaders, including Azikiwe, were tipped off about the coup before it happened. Besides the northern leaders, the premier of the western region, Ladoke Akintola, and Yoruba senior military officers were also killed. The coup not only targeted Nigeria's political elite but also led to the deaths of many leaders in the Nigerian Federal Army, including 7 officers ranked above colonel. Of these 7, 4 were from the north, 2 from the southeast, and 1 from the Midwest. Only one of the officers killed was Igbo. Their intention was to dismantle the northern-dominated power structure, but their efforts to take power were unsuccessful. Johnson Aguiyi Ironsi, an Igbo and loyalist head of the Nigerian army, suppressed coup operations in the south, and he was declared head of state on the 16th of January after the surrender of the majors. Aguiyi Ironsi suspended the constitution and dissolved parliament. He also abolished the regional system of government and pushed for a more centralized, unitary form of government, which was in line with the policies favored by the NCNC, National Council of Nigeria, and the Cameroons. It seemed that his decisions were influenced by the NCNC's political ideas. The NCNC was formed and led by Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe. Ironsi made a critical mistake by not bringing the coup plotters to trial, as military law required, and as most northern and western officers advised. Instead, the plotters remained in the military on full pay, with some even promoted while awaiting trial. Despite the coup's failure, many saw it as benefiting the Igbo people since the plotters faced no serious consequences, and Igbo political leaders were unaffected. While most of the plotters were Igbo, those who carried out the coup were largely northern, and the military and political leaders from the north and west were mostly killed, while those from the east remained untouched. Even though Ironsi, an Igbo himself, tried to gain favor with the north, suspicions grew of an Igbo conspiracy, especially after the killing of northern leaders and the brutal murder of Brigadier General Ademilegun's pregnant wife by the coup executioners. Colonel Odumegwu Ojukwu became the military governor of the eastern region at this time. On May 24, 1966, the military government introduced Unification Decree No. 34, which aimed to replace the federal system with a more centralized government. This decree was deeply unacceptable to the northern region, as it threatened their power and influence. Also, after the January coup, many Igbos in the north were accused of mocking their northern hosts over the deaths of their leaders. A well-known example was Igbo musician Celestine Ukwu, who released a song called "Goats Are Crying," which was seen as making fun of the late Ahmadu Bello. These kinds of provocations became so widespread that the military government issued Decree 44 of 1966, banning such acts. In one of his books, Nigeria's first president, Nnamdi Azikiwe, noted that some Igbo people living in northern Nigeria taunted northerners after the first coup. They did this by mocking northern leaders through songs, records, pictures, pamphlets, and postcards, which portrayed certain northerners, both living and deceased, in a way that was likely to stir anger and resentment. In response to provocation from the Eastern media, which published humiliating images of the northern politicians who had been killed, northern soldiers at the Abeokuta barracks mutinied on the night of July 29, 1966. This sparked a counter-coup that had already been in the works. Ironsi, who was visiting Ibadan at the time, was killed along with his host, Adekunle Fajuyi. The counter-coup led to the appointment of Lieutenant Colonel Yakubu Gowon as the new Supreme Commander of the Nigerian Armed Forces. Gowon was seen as a compromise candidate. He was a northerner, a Christian, from a minority tribe, and had a good reputation within the army. Gowon immediately faced challenges, not just from the east, but also secession threats from both the northern and western regions. The plotters behind the counter-coup had even considered withdrawing from the Federation. However, ambassadors from the UK and the US advised Gowon to keep the country united. Following their advice, Gowon repealed the Unification Decree and announced a return to the federal system. While these official interventions were taking place, there was a corresponding spillover on the streets. In response to the mocking by some Igbos, violent attacks broke out in the north from June to October 1966. These attacks led to the deaths of an estimated 10,000 to 30,000 Igbos, with half of them being children. More than 1 to 2 million people were forced to flee to the eastern region. September 29, 1966, became known as Black Thursday, as it was considered the worst day of the massacres. The flood of refugees in eastern Nigeria created a challenging situation. Extensive talks were held between Ojukwu, representing eastern Nigeria, and Gowon, representing the federal military government. These talks led to the Aburi Accord, signed in Aburi, Ghana, where both sides agreed to create a looser federation. However, Gowon delayed announcing the agreement and eventually went back on his word. On May 27, 1967, Gowon announced the division of Nigeria into 12 states. This decree split the eastern region into 3 parts: Southeastern State, River State, and East Central State. As a result, the Igbos, now concentrated in East Central State, lost control over most of the country's oil, which was located in the other 2 states. In response to Gowon's failure to honor the Aburi Accord, Colonel Odumegwu declared eastern Nigeria a sovereign state, naming it the Republic of Biafra. The federal military government quickly imposed a blockade on all shipping to and from Biafra, but initially excluded oil tankers. Biafra, in response, began collecting oil royalties from companies operating within its territory. When Shell BP agreed to this request in late June, the federal government expanded the blockade to include oil. This blockade, which was widely supported by foreign countries, played a major role in putting Biafra at a disadvantage right from the start of the war. Despite being a young nation with a severe shortage of weapons, Biafra was determined to defend itself. While there was widespread sympathy for Biafra in Europe and other parts of the world, only 5 countries, Tanzania, Gabon, Ivory Coast, Zambia, and Haiti, officially recognized the new republic. The United Kingdom supported the Nigerian side, officially to help preserve the multi-ethnic country it had created, but also to protect its oil interests in Nigeria and safeguard Shell BP's investments. On the other hand, Biafra received help from France, although the French government denied directly supporting Biafra. A report in Paris Match on November 20, 1968, claimed that French arms were being sent to Biafra through neighboring countries like Gabon. The massive flow of weapons from the UK played a crucial role in determining the outcome of the war. The Nigerian government, after expanding its blockade to include oil, launched a police action to reclaim Biafra. The war began in the early hours of July 6, 1967, when Nigerian federal troops advanced into Biafra in 2 columns. The Nigerian Army's offensive was led by Colonel Mohammed Shua and the 1st Infantry Division, made up mostly of northern officers. The western column advanced on the town of Nsukka, which fell on July 14, while the eastern column captured Garkam on July 12. In response to the Nigerian offensive, Biafran forces launched an attack of their own. On August 9, 1967, Biafran troops crossed their western border and the Niger River into Nigeria's midwestern state. They captured the state capital, Benin City, and advanced westward until August 21, when they were stopped at Arare, about 210 kilometers, 130 miles, east of Lagos. The Biafran attack was led by Lieutenant Colonel Victor Banjo, a Yoruba man with the rank of brigadier in the Biafran army. The invasion met little resistance. In response, General Gowon asked Colonel Murtala Mohammed, who would later become head of state in 1975, to form the 2nd Infantry Division to push the Biafrans out of the Midwest, defend the western border, and launch an attack on Biafra. Gowon also declared total war and mobilized the entire Nigerian population for the war effort. From the summer of 1967 to the spring of 1969, the Nigerian Federal Army grew from 7,000 to 200,000 men, organized into 3 divisions. Biafra started the war with only 230 soldiers at Enugu, but by August 1967, their army had grown to 2 battalions, which soon expanded into 2 brigades, the 51st and 52nd, becoming the core of the Biafran army. By 1969, Biafra had around 90,000 soldiers, organized into 5 divisions, though these were undermanned, along with a number of independent units. Although the Nigerians retook Benin City on September 22, the Biafrans succeeded in their primary objective by tying down as many Nigerian federal troops as possible. Meanwhile, General Gowon launched an offensive into Biafra from the south, using the bulk of the Lagos Garrison Command, led by Colonel Benjamin Adekunle, known as the Black Scorpion. This force became the 3rd Infantry Division, later renamed the 3rd Marine Commando. As the war dragged on, the Nigerian army began recruiting soldiers from a wider range of ethnic groups, including the Yoruba, Itsekiri, Yoruba, Edo, and Ijaw. The Nigerian command was split into 2 brigades, each with 3 battalions. The 1st Brigade advanced along the Ogunga-Nsukka Road, while the 2nd Brigade moved along the Gakem-Abudu-Agoja Road. By July 10, 1967, the 1st Brigade had captured all of its assigned territories, and by July 12, the 2nd Brigade had taken Gakem, Ogudu, and Agoja. Enugu, the heart of Biafran resistance, was seen by the Nigerian government as the key to ending the secession. Nigerian forces began their plans to capture Enugu on September 12, 1967, and successfully took the city on October 4. Ojukwu, who was in the Biafran State House at the time, narrowly escaped, disguising himself as a servant. Many hoped that Enugu's fall would convince the Biafra elite to abandon support for secession, but this didn't happen. Ojukwu relocated the government to Umuahia, deep in Igbo territory. The loss of Enugu temporarily weakened Biafran propaganda, as the Ministry of Information became disorganized, and Biafran claims about Nigeria's inability to sustain a prolonged war were undermined. However, on October 23, Biafran Radio announced that Ojukwu would continue resisting the Nigerian government, blaming the loss of Enugu on subversive actions. Operation Tiger Claw, from October 17 to 20, 1967, involved a Nigerian invasion of Calabar, led by Colonel Benjamin Adekunle, the Black Scorpion. The Biafrans, under Colonel Ogbu Ogi and foreign mercenary Lynn Garrison, were bombarded by Nigerian air forces. Garrison's forces withdrew by October 20, and Ogi surrendered to General Adekunle. By May 1968, Port Harcourt was captured, alongside Enugu, Bonny, and Calabar, showing clear Nigerian military superiority. Biafran propaganda often blamed military defeats on saboteurs within their ranks, and officers suspected of disloyalty were frequently executed by Ojukwu. This paranoia led to a series of purges, as Ojukwu did not trust many of the former federal Igbo officers who had joined Biafra, fearing them as potential rivals. These purges severely hurt morale within the Biafran military and undermined their ability to conduct successful operations. The constant fear of coups also led Ojukwu to form special units like the S Brigade and the 4th Commando Brigade, commanded by foreign mercenaries, to operate outside the regular chain of command. This instability and lack of cohesion greatly weakened Biafra's military effectiveness, as officers were killed off rather than gaining the experience needed to improve. With increased British support, the Nigerian Federal Forces launched their final major offensive against the Biafrans on December 23, 1969. Led by the 3rd Marine Commando Division under Colonel Olusegun Obasanjo, who would later become Nigeria's president twice, this attack succeeded in splitting the Biafran enclave into two by the end of the year. The final offensive, called Operation Tailwind, began on January 7, 1970, with the 3rd Marine Commando Division attacking, supported by the 1st and 2nd Infantry Divisions. Biafran towns like Owerri fell on January 9, and Uli on January 11. Ojukwu, the Biafran leader, fled into exile in the Ivory Coast just days earlier, leaving his deputy, Philip Effiong, to oversee the surrender to General Yakubu Gowon of the Nigerian Federal Army on January 13, 1970. The formal surrender was signed in Lagos on January 14, marking the end of the Civil War and the renouncement of secession. The fighting ended shortly after, as Nigerian forces advanced into the remaining Biafran-held territories with little resistance.